Roosevelt, Astor, Forbes, Yale, Harvard. You know these names. But what you probably don't know is that they all got rich the exact same way. By flooding China with opium, thousands of tons, millions of addicts, and profits soaring over 400%. And for the next 200 years, they made sure you would never find out. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who saved America from the Great Depression, whose face is carved into Mount Rushmore. His family fortune came from selling hard drugs, opium. Millions of people addicted, millions dead, and the Roosevelts got rich, very rich. And they weren't alone. The Astors, once the wealthiest family in America, drug money, Forbes magazine. Built on opium profits, Yale's infamous Skull and Bones Society. Funded by drug smugglers, even some of Harvard's most iconic buildings were paid for with silver earned from the Chinese opium trade. Think about that. Some of the most powerful families in American history. The institutions that educate our leaders. The dynasties that still hold influence in this country. Much of it was built by flooding an entire nation with drugs. This wasn't a small-time operation. It was industrial scale. Thousands of tons of opium were shipped, generating profit margins that are almost unimaginable today. And then, they buried the evidence. They rewrote the history books, built libraries, museums, and universities with the blood money, and created a legacy that made sure you'd never connect the dots. But you can't erase history completely. The shipping records still exist. The personal letters have survived. The account books are sitting in archives, waiting to be read. And what they reveal is shocking. They show that America's original aristocracy, the families we're taught to respect, made their fortunes doing exactly what we imprison people for today. Except they did it on a scale that poisoned an entire country, destroyed the Chinese economy, and made them so wealthy they could simply write it all out of history. This is the story they never wanted you to know. The story of how drug dealers became American royalty and how they got away with it for 2 centuries. Let's look closer at Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States, who led the country through the Great Depression and World War II. An American hero. But here's what they don't teach you in school. The fortune that funded his privileged upbringing. His elite education at Harvard. His entry into politics all came from drug money. His own grandfather, Warren Delano II, made a massive fortune smuggling illegal opium into China. While millions of Chinese people became hopelessly addicted and millions died, the Delano family became extraordinarily rich. This wasn't a secret side hustle. It was their main business. Again, they were not alone. John Jacob Astor, America's first multimillionaire, made a significant part of his fortune in the opium trade. The Forbes family. Yes, that Forbes built their publishing empire on opium profits. The Perkins family helped fund Yale University with their share of the trade. The Cabot family in Boston. The Russell family who founded Skull and Bones at Yale, all of them major players. These weren't just participants. They were dominant forces. By the 1830s, American companies controlled about 10% of the entire opium trade into China. We're talking tons of raw opium, generating what would be hundreds of millions, not billions, of dollars today. An entire generation in China was devastated by addiction. These American families got so rich they could found universities, build hospitals, launch political dynasties that still influence the country today. This is the untold story. This is how America's elite families made their initial fortunes. They then spent the next century whitewashing that history. The most staggering hypocrisy is that the same families who got rich selling drugs would later support and enact policies that criminalize drugs for everyone else, disproportionately affecting the poor and marginalized. The proof is undeniable, hidden in plain sight within the archives of the very institutions they funded. The story of America's rise is far more complex and far darker than we're already taught. You've probably heard of the Opium Wars, but the story, might be the sanitized museum version. Let's talk about the reality. In the early 1800s, Britain faced a massive trade imbalance with China. They were buying huge quantities of tea, silk, and porcelain, but China wasn't interested in British goods. This meant Britain was bleeding silver, draining its national treasury. They needed something to sell to China, something that Chinese people would buy in massive quantities. And they found it opium. This wasn't just any opium. It was grown in British-controlled India, refined into a potent, smokable form, and then smuggled into China, where it was strictly illegal. The Chinese government knew it was a poison and had banned it outright. But for British and American traders, the profits were just too good to ignore. We're talking 400 to 500% profit margins. You could buy a stash of opium in India for $100 and sell it in China for $500 or $600. The risks were incredibly high. If caught, Chinese authorities would execute smugglers on the spot. But the lure of immense wealth was stronger. American families, in particular, wanted a piece of the action. Their secret weapon? Clipper ships. These ships were built for one thing: speed. They were perfect for outrunning Chinese naval patrols and delivering their illegal cargo to secret coastal locations. Here's how the operation worked. An American captain would sail to British India, load his ship with thousands of pounds of opium, and then sail to the Chinese coast. They would anchor just offshore at pre-arranged spots. Then, Chinese smugglers in small boats would row out, swap silver for the opium, and row back. The American ships never officially entered Chinese ports, giving them a thin veil of plausible deniability. And the silver, it flowed back to America by the ton. This illicit trade went on for decades, from the early 1800s until the Opium Wars kicked off in the 1840s, and it even continued after. Millions of Chinese citizens became addicted, devastating their society and economy as silver poured out of the country and into British and American pockets. In America, the families who got rich from this misery used their fortunes to build legitimate business empires that still exist today. Let's take a closer look at who some of these families were. Let's start with one of the most famous names, the Delanos. The family of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Warren Delano II, FDR's grandfather, was born in Massachusetts in 1809. At just 19, he sailed to China to work for a trading company. By the time he was 24, he was a senior partner in Russell and Company, the largest and most powerful American opium trading firm in China. Russell and Company didn't just dabble in the opium trade. They dominated the American side of it. They had offices in Canton, a fleet of fast clipper ships, and deep connections with British opium growers in India. And they made millions. For 13 years, from 1833 to 1846, Warren Delano personally ran this massive opium smuggling operation. He eventually returned to America a very, very wealthy man. How wealthy? Rich enough to build a 40-room mansion in New York. Rich enough to send his children to the most exclusive schools. And when he lost a chunk of his fortune in the financial panic of 1857, he was rich enough to simply go back to China, make another fortune in the opium trade, and return even wealthier than before. His daughter, Sarah Delano, married James Roosevelt. Their son was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the 32nd President of the United States. FDR grew up surrounded by immense wealth, with private tutors, a Harvard education, and powerful political connections, all of it funded by the profits from his grandfather's opium smuggling. And here's the unbelievable irony. In 1935, while FDR was president, he signed some of the first federal laws to strictly control drugs in the United States, precursors to the Marijuana Tax Act. The very man whose family fortune was built on addicting Chinese people to drugs spent his presidency criminalizing drugs for Americans. It's a staggering hypocrisy that's been largely erased from our history books. When you hear the name Astor, what comes to mind? The Waldorf Astoria Hotel. Titanic victim John Jacob Astor IV. Maybe New York City. High society. This family was once the richest in America, a true dynasty. The official story is that their founder, John Jacob Astor, made his fortune in the fur trade. That's true, but it's not the whole story. It's not even the most important part. The real secret to the Astor fortune wasn't beaver pelts. It was opium. Starting around 1800, Astor's ships began sailing to China. One of them, the Macedonian, became a regular on the opium run. You see, Astor wasn't just trading furs for Chinese tea and silk. He was smuggling Turkish opium into China, trading it for silver. Then, he used that silver to buy the Chinese goods everyone wanted back home. The opium leg of the journey was the engine that powered the entire operation. It was incredibly profitable. By 1840, Astor was worth an estimated $20 million, which is over $500 million in today's money. The vast majority of that wealth came from the opium trade. When his great-grandson died on the Titanic, he was one of the richest men in the world, and that massive fortune was built on a foundation of drug money. The Astor name is plastered on libraries, museums, and university buildings, all monuments funded by a hidden history of addiction. Now, let's talk about the Forbes family. Yes, that Forbes. The one behind the famous magazine that ranks the world's billionaires. Their story also starts in the early 1800s, with ships sailing from Boston to China. Two brothers, Robert Bennett, Forbes, and John Murray Forbes, were key players in the opium trade. They worked with a firm called Russell and Company, which was the biggest American player in the business. Robert Forbes even captained the fast clipper ships that carried the drug. His brother, John, was the financial genius. He took the enormous profits from the opium sales and invested them back in the United States, primarily in the booming railroad industry. This made him one of Boston's wealthiest and most powerful men. Generations later, his descendants used that very same fortune to launch Forbes magazine. The family became American aristocracy, their name synonymous with wealth and success. And it all started with opium. In Boston, John Murray Forbes is celebrated as a great philanthropist and a captain of industry. There are statues of him, buildings named in his honor, but you'll have a hard time finding any mention of how he really made his money. That part of the story has been conveniently scrubbed from the history books. And the story doesn't end there. Let's look at the Perkins family of Boston. Thomas Handaseed Perkins, known as T.H. Perkins, was another one of New England's richest men in the 19th century. He was a famous philanthropist who funded hospitals, asylums, and schools, a true pillar of the community. So how did he make his money? You guessed it, opium. Perkins was a founding partner of a firm that later became part of Russell and Company, the same smuggling ring the Forbes brothers worked for. For decades, his ships funneled opium from Turkey and India into China, earning him millions. When he retired, he poured that money into charitable causes, burnishing his reputation as a great man. The prestigious Perkins School for the Blind in Boston, funded by opium money. A fellowship at Yale University bearing the Perkins name. Opium money. Just like with the Astors and the Forbes, the dark origins of the Perkins family fortune are either ignored or downplayed. It is a pattern you see, again and again. Celebrated American dynasties whose legacies were built on the profits of the drug trade. These aren't just footnotes in history. They are the hidden foundations of some of America's greatest fortunes. Ever wondered where the old money of America's most powerful families really came from? The kind of wealth that builds Ivy League universities and produces presidents? The answer is darker and more shocking than you might imagine. Let's peel back the layers of history and look at the fortunes built on a devastating trade. We'll start with the Russell family. In 1823, Samuel Russell founded Russell and Company, which quickly became the biggest American player in the China trade. But what were they trading? Opium. They smuggled vast quantities of it into China, addicting millions and making an obscene fortune. Samuel Russell eventually retired to Connecticut, a very wealthy man. Then, in 1832, his cousin, William Huntington Russell, co-founded a secret society at Yale University. You might have heard of it. Skull and Bones. This is the legendary secret society that has counted U.S. presidents like George H.W. Bush and George W. Bush, Supreme Court justices, and CIA directors among its members. Yes, one of the most powerful and secretive organizations in American history was established with a fortune built on the back of the opium trade. Samuel Russell's money also went into the Russell Trust Association, which, to this day, still funds the operations of Skull and Bones. It is a stunning reality. The foundation of America's elite was laid with Chinese opium money. But the Russells weren't alone. Let's head over to Boston and talk about the Boston Brahmins, a city's old, respected aristocratic families. Take the Cabot family. Their name is synonymous with prestige in Boston. There's Cabot House at Harvard, Cabot Street, the Cabot Corporation. They are the definition of old money, but trace that money back to its source in the early 1800s, and you'll find the same story. The China trade. And guess what their most profitable commodity was? Opium. The family's vast wealth, the very foundation of their enduring legacy, was built on smuggling the same destructive drug. Yet, that part of their history is conveniently scrubbed from the public narrative. Then there's the Low family, another prominent dynasty. Abil Abat Low ran a fleet of clipper ships, sailing back and forth to China, making millions. His business, you guessed it, opium. He became one of the wealthiest men in Brooklyn. His son, Seth Low, would go on to become the president of Columbia University and later, the mayor of New York City. The family's generosity is literally carved into the stone of a prestigious university. If you ever visit Columbia's campus, you'll see the magnificent Low Memorial Library. That iconic building was funded by family money that originated from the opium trade, an Ivy League landmark built with drug profits. Do you see the pattern here? It's a blueprint for laundering a fortune and a reputation. Step 1. Ambitious American men go to China in the early 19th century and get into the opium smuggling business. Step 2. They make astronomical fortunes. We're talking profits of 400% to 500% on a single voyage. In today's terms, they became billionaires. Step 3. They return to America as respected, wealthy businessmen. Step 4. They diversify their wealth, investing in railroads, manufacturing, and real estate, legitimizing their money. And the final, most crucial step, they become philanthropists. They donate lavishly to universities, museums, hospitals, and libraries. They build the very cultural and educational institutions that define American society. In doing so, they whitewash their past. The origin of their wealth, a fact that it came from a brutal, illegal drug trade, gets erased from the history books, replaced by a sanitized story of Yankee ingenuity and respectable commerce. Their descendants become American aristocracy, and the dirty secret stays buried. And make no mistake, this wasn't a small-time operation. By the 1830s, American firms like Russell and Company controlled a significant slice of the opium smuggled into China. They were shipping thousands of chests of opium every year, with each chest containing around 140 pounds of the raw drug. This was an industrial-scale enterprise that continued for decades. Even after China fought and lost the wars, the opium wars trying to stop it, the American smugglers just got more discreet. So, the next time you walk through an Ivy League campus or see a famous family name on a building, take a moment to ask where that legacy really began. The story of America as elite is deeply intertwined with a history that many would prefer we forget. Let's talk about a comparison most people never make. Think back to the 1980s and 90s crack crisis. Remember the serious questions raised about whether some U.S. government agencies, while fighting communism abroad, indirectly allowed cocaine to flood into American cities. This devastated communities, especially black neighborhoods. When journalists like Gary Webb exposed these connections, it ignited a national firestorm. There were hearings, debates, and even some officials admitting to major policy failures. Webb faced huge backlash, but his work forced a conversation about how political decisions can unleash hell on vulnerable people. Now, let's rewind the clock to the 1800s and use that same lens. Did you know that some of America's most prominent trading families were deeply involved in the opium trade in China? This wasn't a small side hustle. It was a massive, coordinated operation that fueled widespread addiction and crippled China's economy for generations. The staggering wealth from this trade helped build some of the very institutions like universities and banks that are still powerful in the U.S. today. But, unlike the crack era, there's been very little public reckoning or accountability for this chapter of history. To give you a sense of the scale, historical estimates showed that between 1800 and 1860, American firms raked in profits of $50 to $100 million. In today's money, that's somewhere between $1.5 and $3 billion. And that's just the profit, not the total value of the trade. This was a sophisticated transnational system with shipping networks, warehouses, financial backers, and thousands of employees, from Boston financiers to Chinese brokers. Back then, it was considered legitimate business, and the men behind it were hailed as titans of industry, not criminals. Let's try a modern analogy to really grasp the impact. Imagine if today, a group of ultra-wealthy Americans was caught secretly running a massive operation to funnel a dangerous new drug into another country. Imagine the addiction, the chaos, the lives lost. Then, imagine they used those profits to fund universities, museums, and political campaigns, with their families remaining influential for generations. Yet, a century later, society just kind of forgets. We avoid talking about where that foundational wealth came from. That's essentially what happened with the 19th century opium trade. We're living in a world partly shaped by fortunes built on that addiction, but the story behind that money remains largely untold. Let's talk about a story that connects some of America's most powerful families, its most prestigious universities, and a dark chapter in history that's been almost completely erased from our textbooks. In China, there's a period known as the Century of Humiliation. Every student learns about it. It's a core part of their national identity. It starts with the Opium Wars, when Western powers, including Britain and America, forced opium onto the Chinese population. This wasn't just trade, it was a strategy. It created millions of addicts, devastated the country's economy, and opened the door for colonization and conflict, leading to millions of deaths. For China, this is a deep, historical wound that has never been forgotten. Now, let's flip the script. Here in America, how much did you learn about the Opium Wars in school? For most of us, the answer is probably little to nothing. We do learn that some of the most prominent American families built their vast fortunes on this trade. We're talking about names you might recognize: Delano Astor, Forbes, Perkins, Russell. These weren't just merchants. They were some of the biggest drug traffickers in history. The contrast is just staggering. One nation remembers what was done to them, while the other conveniently forgets what it did, and the families who profited from it all. They've been more than happy to let this history stay buried. So, what do we do with this information? First, we have to tell the truth, plainly. Families like the Delanos, whose descendant Franklin Delano Roosevelt would become president, made their initial fortune selling opium. The Forbes family, yes, the one behind Forbes magazine, built their wealth the same way. The Russell family's profits from the opium trade helped fund one of Yale's most famous secret societies, Skull and Bones. This wasn't a small-time operation. They devastated a nation, and in return they became so rich they could establish American dynasties that still hold immense wealth and power today. Second, we need to acknowledge the hypocrisy. Many of these same families, after amassing fortunes from the drug trade, turned around and used their influence to push for drug prohibition for everyone else. They became pillars of society, moral leaders, while hiding the source of their own wealth. They criminalized for others what had made them rich. Third, this forces us to question the very foundations of institutions we revere. Yale, Harvard, Columbia, many of our top universities receive significant funding derived from opium money. Museums, hospitals, charitable foundations, their cornerstones were laid, in part, with profits from this devastating trade. Should these institutions acknowledge this history? Should there be some form of reconciliation or reparations? Should the families who still benefit from this generational wealth be held accountable? These are uncomfortable questions, but they are essential. Because right now, descendants of these families are still part of America's elite. They still wield influence that traces its origins back to the opium dens of 19th century China, and they have never had to answer for it. This isn't some wild conspiracy theory. This is documented history, confirmed by shipping records, family letters, and academic research. Books have been written about it, but this story has been actively suppressed, scrubbed from the popular narrative. Why? Because the truth is ugly. The truth reveals that some of America's most respected dynasties were founded by drug kingpins. The institutions they built, the political power they established, were financed by the deliberate poisoning of millions of people. The opium families got away with it for 200 years. But the truth has a way of coming out. If this story changed how you see American history, make sure you subscribe. There are so many more buried truths we need to dig up together. Thanks for watching.